I know that's a hard act to follow, but I hope you all will stick around for our final keynote. And it follows on the talk that you just heard very well. Dan mentioned during his talk that he doesn't go around talking about the energy transition as a climate play. He talks about it as a national security issue, a jobs creation, an economic development issue. So to follow on that, I think we're very lucky to have Lachlan Carey here to kind of close up our keynotes. Lachlan is with the Rocky Mountain Institute. Many of you are familiar with its founder, Amory Lovins. Amory and the Rocky Mountain Institute have been thought leaders on the energy transition in the US now for decades. And you may wonder why someone like we've invited Lachlan to speak here today, who's not a technology expert. He comes out of the policy and economic space. It's because Lachlan has been doing research on how to promote the energy transition regionally by selling the economic development component of the transition. And today we're very lucky to have him speak on what the energy transition could mean for our region, the Mid-Atlantic, the Southeast, in terms of job creation, economic development, and just creating a picture that, regardless of your political affiliation, will be really hard to reject. Thank you so much for being here today, Lachlan. We really appreciate it. And we appreciate the Rocky Mountain Institute also helping us with this event. Yesterday, some of you might have met Aaron Brickman, his colleague. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you, Greg, and I really appreciate everyone sticking around till 4 o'clock. I know it's been a long couple of days, and that was certainly a tough act to follow. So I'm going to do my best, but I do think it's he provided a great segue here in terms of he set the tone of optimism that I think we see in Biden's green industrial strategy, which I'm going to talk about, and he had a video about Australia, which I appreciated, and can bring some of that experience here. So first, I want to speak to the title here, Biden's Green Industrial Strategy. I want to note RMI is a non-partisan institution. I'm Australian, so I can't vote. I have no sort of dog in this particular race. But I think it's important to zoom out. I'm going to give sort of the 30,000-foot view on what this means globally and a bit of context for how that broader green industrial strategy affects the Mid-Atlantic region. So you just saw this chart, so I don't need to spend too much time explaining it. But as we all know from the last couple of days in 2022, something pretty remarkable happened. With just 50 Democratic senators, but President Biden managed to pass the most significant piece of climate legislation, not just in US history, but globally. And so the US is now on track to meet its highly ambitious 50% target by 2030, sorry. And so the real question is, like, how did this happen? So that's what I want to go through today. So this is a screenshot from Biden's speech not 1 hour ago here in North Carolina, where I think he did a pretty good job of sort of putting forward what I call green industrial strategy means, but what he calls investing in America. And what that means is that what we've seen is through the American Rescue Plan, CHIPS and Science Act, bipartisan infrastructure bill, and of course the Inflation Reduction Act, a truly remarkable about turn in US economic policy making, and not just the sort of climate side of this. So what is green industrial policy? I think it's important to set some boundaries, give you some definitions. So with regard to the climate, it's not any one particular policy. It's not about tax credits. It's not about loan guarantees. It's about setting the direction for an economy. And that's a pretty significant shift, right? We're going from free market first, let the private sector sort of go where it will, and the government comes in to sort of fix some of the market failures. So here's a quote from a group of political scientists who define it as the intent to restructure and transform the economy into a green economy. And now that's pretty ambitious. And I think it's important to step back and view it in this broader context. So this return of industrial policy, to me, it almost feels inevitable when we look back at it in hindsight. And there are three sort of mega trends that I think are responsible for this about turn in US economic policy. First, we had this period of stagnation following the Great Recession. And this has really called for a broader role of government in setting the direction of economic growth. Second, of course, we've heard a lot about the rise of China. Now, not only did this sort of come at the expense of a lot of US manufacturing jobs, but it also brought down the cost of clean energy technologies. So this trade-off has been really interesting in this space. And then finally, we can't talk about this without acknowledging the rising racial and regional inequalities that have grown over the course of the last 10, 20, 40 years in the United States. And you see that dynamic really playing out in a lot of the provisions within all three major pieces of Biden legislation. So first, I'm going to talk briefly about this idea of economic stagnation and what I call the visible hand, right? So this goes all the way back to Alexander Hamilton, one of America's founding fathers. Whenever you talk about industrial policy, you have to talk about Alexander Hamilton. And don't worry, I'm not going to try to rap. But and so in his famous report on the subject of manufacturers, I believe 1789, he wrote that the public purse must supply the deficiency of private resource. And this is simply an 18th century way of saying sometimes the private market won't do everything you need from a socially optimal point of view, and it's up to the government to step in. And more to the point, there are going to be critical sectors in which the government needs to devote extra attention. And we've clearly seen that in this administration, whether it's semiconductors, obviously solar, now hydrogen, that the Biden administration has decided there are certain sectors that are going to define US economic growth in the 21st century, and it's up to the government to step in and do so. Now, if we think about the broader context here, the 2010s were really almost a lost decade for the United States economically. Now, this chart shows you sort of real GDP growth in terms of the trend from the 1990s through 2000s, and then what happened with the Great Recession. And you saw this divergence, right, between where the US economy was expected to go and where it ended up. And that gap amounts to about $5 trillion. And we all know that that $5 trillion, we know where it didn't go, right? It didn't go to the bottom of the pyramid, to many of the people in this country that need it most. And as I'm going to talk about later, that's really fomented this sort of populist backlash in US politics. But more broadly, from sort of the economic intelligentsia, it's really created this demand for a more active role of government in closing that gap, in bringing the US economy more in line with the type of economic growth and trajectory that you might expect. So Larry Summers, who you might often see in the news, he called this problem that of secular stagnation, which is a persistent deficit in aggregate demand. And so what you really saw with the American Rescue Plan in particular was that fiscal stimulus, that injection to try and bring the US economy and bring US investment back up to this sort of trajectory. So speaking of US investment, you can see this decline in private investment over time. So what this chart shows you is private investment as a share of GDP going all the way back to the 1960s. And what I've done here is take an average of each business cycle of where that private investment was as a share of economic activity. And what you see is that private investment as a share of the whole economy has been falling in each business cycle since the 1960s. Now, private investment, economists call this the accelerator effect, that investment responds to demand. You're not going to invest in new capital facilities unless you know the demand is there. So ultimately, you need to boost demand. You need to inject funds and investment into the economy in order to bring private investment back up. Now, private investment is important, not just because of the jobs it creates in the factory that gets announced, but it's an investment in the productive capacity of the economy. And ultimately, it's productivity that creates economic growth, that boosts living standards across the country. And yet again, we see that the US has been in a slump. 1990 to 2000, 2000 to 2007, each subsequent decade, you've seen productivity growth in the country fall. And I believe that's hugely tied to this decline in private investment, which in turn is tied to the falling aggregate demand. So here's just the broad context for sort of the world we live in now and why the Biden administration sort of felt compelled to act in the ways that it has. So how did it act? Well, it's responded with unprecedented spending, especially on the climate. So this is a chart I put together that shows you the average annual spending of the US federal government on climate-related initiatives in each decade since the early 90s. And it's pretty obvious the change that we see that we expect over the next sort of 5 to 10 years, where we predict about $80 billion a year of average federal investment into climate-related initiatives between CHIPS, IRA, and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or bill. And so that's 2.5 times what we saw even at the peak of federal spending in response to the Great Recession. Sorry. Oh, there you go. And obviously multiples more than what we saw in the 1990s. And so this really is unprecedented. And as we've heard from a few of our DOE speakers, together this represents some $500 billion worth of investments. But we call this bottomless mimosas. And so due to the way a number of the tax credits are designed in the Inflation Reduction Act, there is no limit. It is limited by the private sector demand for these investments. And so we've estimated that in a climate-aligned scenario, so one in which the US meets its climate goals by 2030, that the Inflation Reduction Act alone would represent about $1 trillion worth of spending. So that's nearly 3 times the estimate that you got out of the Congressional Budget Office. Now, why is that? Let's take the hydrogen production tax credit, for example, which is the chart on my left shows, we expect could be 5 times the amount that's estimated by the Congressional Budget Office. That's because how does the CBO know how much green hydrogen is going to be produced in the next 10 years? None of us in this room know. And so they're taking a guess, and we expect that the private sector is going to respond pretty dramatically to what are some really significant incentives. And so the point here being that the federal government support is actually going to be much larger than what has been led on. And the other key difference there, I think, is the EV supply chain. Again, if you look at the CBO's estimates of how many EVs are going to be on the road by 2030, it's pretty conservative. And I think most of us in this room have decided we want an EV if the EV was there, if the production happened. And clearly the private sector is recognizing this and is going to jump on the various tax credits available in the Inflation Reduction Act. There's also likely going to be a further $840 billion worth of loan guarantees and direct lending. So what do I mean by that? So for instance, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is up the top there. In the official budget estimate, that's $27 billion to start some green banks around the country. Well, what does $27 billion get you? That is the capitalization of banks that can lend that money over and over again. They can create money, they can do what banks are intended to do. So if you take an estimate of, say, the Loan Program Office, and the way that it has used its capitalization to provide loan guarantees or loans in the advanced vehicle manufacturing sector, that's often 10x what the initial capitalization was. So suddenly a $27 billion capitalization becomes $300 billion worth of investments around the country. The same is true for the Energy Infrastructure Reinvestment Financing at the Loan Program Office. They get $5 billion in the official estimate, but a $250 billion loan authority to use in various investments around the country. And so you can see there's a range of these different programs where it's not just about the government stepping in and doing it, it's about the government encouraging private investment. And that's where you see this real sort of industrial policy kind of head shift happen. Now, how does this affect different states? So this is from our same estimates of a climate-aligned scenario, and you can see some pretty significant differences by state. Often that depends on the renewable energy potential and particularly proximity to wind, where we expect a lot of the green hydrogen production to happen. But even in states like in our estimates, the Mid-Atlantic region, where that per capita investment dollars per person is a lower level, you still see pretty significant job creation happening in the Mid-Atlantic region. So about 1/3 of the jobs we expect to be in the manufacturing sector. For Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia, that's nearly 40,000 manufacturing jobs by 2030, a further 25,000 in construction and services. Again, this is a climate-aligned scenario. There's no guarantee that we'll get there. This isn't a prediction of what's going to happen, but it is a sense of the opportunity that's available to us if we're willing to take it. So to talk about the deployment in the Mid-Atlantic region, again, if we take our climate-aligned estimate, you see electric vehicles grow by 6.5 million over the next 8 years, just in these 4 states. You see an additional 53 gigawatts of clean electricity deployed, 3.5 million heat pumps installed in houses across the region, and over 410 million kilograms of green hydrogen consumed annually. Now, this is daunting. I've been in a lot of sessions in the last 2 days that have spoken to the investment barriers, the real challenges that we have ahead of us. And there's no doubt about that. But the flip side of that coin is the opportunity that's available in all the additional heat pump installer jobs, in all the additional industries that can benefit from access to green hydrogen, and so on and so forth. But the IRA is incredibly complex. So what you see this chart on the left here is all the spending in the three bills and the type of policy instrument that uses it. So whether it's a production tax credit, a grant, a research grant, a consumption tax credit, direct loans, there's over 15 different instruments that the government needs to be across and be able to implement in an effective and efficient way. And there's more than 20 agencies responsible for delivering all this. So there's a significant challenge for the federal government here. And the challenge that is being presented by the Biden administration is unparalleled in sort of modern times. And what we can't afford are any bridges to nowhere. I mean, we all remember the cylinder debacle. And if you spend any time studying industrial policy in China, you see that they've had enormous problems in infrastructure build out that never got used, in apartment buildings that remain empty and are destroyed on a weekly basis because they can't rent them out. And so this is obviously a significant problem if you don't do it correctly, if your incentives aren't aligned. So the challenges ahead of us really are pretty stunning. And so the question is, do we have the state capacity for all this? So what this chart shows you is that there's been a 500% increase in government spending since 1960, and just a 50% increase in the size of the federal government workforce. Now, as a former federal government employee myself back in Australia, I'd like to think that's a 10x increase in the productivity of bureaucrats. But also, having been a former bureaucrat, I suspect that's not the case. And so what you see here really is that both sides of the aisle have stripped back the government's ability to implement the kind of ambitious investments that we're seeing. And, while there has been some positive turnaround from the Biden administration, we're still a long way away from addressing this long-term erosion in government capacity. So the second megatrend, what I call rising dragon, falling eagle. Here I'm clearly talking about the rise of China. Now, it's easy to forget just how significant and world-changing the rise of China has been since 2001. And what's remarkable about it is that it's provoked one of the few bipartisan consensus topics in Washington, D.C. right now. So here you see two quotes from their State of the Union speeches of President Trump in 2019 and Biden in 2023. Now, these are remarkably similar statements. And to me, that's quite a shocking turnaround, but it also makes a lot of sense given what we've seen in the impacts across the country due to this sort of unprecedented shift in the global economic environment. So to provide some numbers to that shift, if you look at the share of global value added in manufacturing, China has gone from around 10% just after it entered the global market, which we put it around the time it entered the World Trade Organization in 2001, to over 30% of the global share today. That's pretty much the inverse of where the US has gone over that same time period. So this, of course, as many of us know in this room, has really contributed to the decline in the US manufacturing sector, whether it's in manufacturing value added, so as a share of GDP, which has dropped by more than 5 percentage points, the number of manufacturing employees in the US, which dropped by over 5 million at its greatest, or manufacturing as a share of exports, we see similar declines across the board. And, you can argue about the efficiency of global supply chains and all the rest of it. And I'm very open to all those arguments. But the point being that this had really sizable economic effects on places, on people, and that the implications of this have only really started to wash through the political system and the policy environment in the last couple of years. I would note, though, that the US manufacturing sector is remarkably resilient. So this chart shows you that over that initial time frame of 2001 to 2008, the US had the largest share of job loss in the manufacturing sector of any advanced economy. But the flip side is, since 2011, it has had the second highest gain in manufacturing jobs of any of those countries, after Taiwan, who, as we all know, has become the sort of semiconductor powerhouse globally. So what has this got to do with climate? Well, China dominates major clean energy industry supply chains, whether it's solar, batteries, and increasingly electrolyzers, heat pumps. You see that China dominates throughout the supply chain. And so what you have here in green is the US global share, and down the bottom of these charts, you have the Chinese manufacturing share. And if you look at the solar supply chain, for instance, you're talking well above 90% in multiple sectors of the supply chain. But the flip side of that is that China, in building out this huge manufacturing sector in clean energy industries, has driven down the cost of the technologies that we rely on to decarbonize our economies, particularly in solar and batteries, which have seen in the order of 90% cost declines over the last 10 years, putting them well into the range of being cost competitive with fossil fuels. This is less true for wind, since a lot of wind manufacturing happens closer to the demand source, simply because it's so difficult to ship around giant wind turbines. So what has the federal government done? Again, it has allocated a bunch of money to this problem. Over $120 billion in Biden's Green Industrial Strategy is allocated explicitly for manufacturing and clean industry. So from this chart, you can see that the bulk of that, at least according to the official CBO estimate, is in the wind, solar, and battery manufacturing production tax, which I'll get to in a second, but a similarly high amount in the hydrogen production tax credit. There's a bunch in there for the EV manufacturing supply chain, particularly through loans, but also through some manufacturing grants as well. And then a range of initiatives, including $8 billion for hydrogen hubs. There's $3.5 billion for direct air cap DAC hubs as well. So I want to talk quickly about 45X, or the Advanced Manufacturing Production Tax Credit, which is really about chasing China, right? It's about trying to bring back that market share in some of these key clean energy industries. And so if you look at solar, wind, inverters, and batteries, which are the technologies covered under that tax credit, on the far column there, you can see that what that shows you is the percentage subsidy of the current price of many of these components, which can range anywhere from 2% to about 40%. Now, to an earlier question we had about can the US compete in the solar manufacturing supply chain, Credit Suisse estimates that the size of these subsidies for solar is about 20 to 40% of the total cost of a solar module. And they expect that within 10 years, US manufactured solar could be 50% cheaper than what we get out of China. Now, you may not trust Credit Suisse right now, but those are their numbers. They also expect wind to be about 50% cheaper. And so I think this is going to be a really significant, and again, we're seeing this in the investments made here in the Mid-Atlantic region. It's not a coincidence that so many of them are in batteries, are in the solar manufacturing supply chain. Now, while 45X is about chasing China in relatively mature technologies where they've already established that lead, the hydrogen production tax credit is going after a much more nascent industry, right? Green hydrogen is still at the beginning of its hype curve, of its technology adoption curve. And so this is about gaining that early foothold in an industry and then holding on to it. And so what you see here in this chart that our hydrogen team have put together is that with the tax credit, green hydrogen is immediately competitive with its fossil fuel counterparts in some of the key industries that are going to be the hardest to abate when it comes to meeting our climate goals. So whether it's shipping fuel, ammonia for fertilizers, or in what's going to be green steel in the near future, hydrogen suddenly becomes cost competitive. And that's because the size of this subsidy, about $3 per kilo of hydrogen produced, that's twice the current price of hydrogen in the market. That's gray hydrogen, obviously. But what it means is that it's a really sizable boost to a nascent industry. And then that means that if the private sector uptake is as significant as we expect it could be, then the size of this production tax credit goes from about $13 billion in the CBO estimate to around $61 billion. And so I really think this is one of the key industries to watch out for in the near future. Now, I don't know what's happened to my slides here, but they seem to have got cut off. But the other way that the Biden administration has tried to bolster US manufacturing is through what's called domestic content provisions. So all this means is that in order to get the tax credit, you need to have produced a certain amount of the material or components within the United States, or in sometimes within free trade agreement countries. So what this infographic shows you is the size of the tax credit for light duty vehicles, so new electric vehicles, which we expect to be about 68% of battery demand by 2030. So you can see that at the really upstream phases of the EV supply chain, about 80% of the critical minerals need to be extracted or processed in the US or a free trade agreement country. My home country of Australia, which produces a lot of lithium, is really happy about that one. In cell component production and battery production, you see that 100% needs to be assembled here in North America. Again, this really helps explain a lot of the recent investments that are being made. And then in OEM and recycling, this too needs to happen in North America. Interestingly, for light commercial vehicles, these provisions don't apply. So I would expect to see a lot more leasing and interesting and creative arrangements happening in the next 10 years in terms of how we produce our and buy our electric vehicles. I've only got about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to try and pick up the pace here. Allies and trade partners have expressed some concerns over these implications, and you start to see a bunch of responses from those countries. Now, as I've mentioned already, we've seen over $40 billion worth of investments in the EV supply chain just since passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. And more broadly, you see that the US reached a record 365,000 job announcements in terms of reshored industries or industries attached to foreign direct investment. Over half of these can directly be tied to Inflation Reduction Act or CHIPS provisions. Here in the Mid-Atlantic region, you see that Georgia and South Carolina have been the big winners so far, taking out the top two spots in terms of IRA investment totals by state. And so this map here shows you that there is this real concentration in the Mid-Atlantic region, and that a lot of the hype you've been hearing the last 2 days isn't for nothing. So finally, I want to spend some time on the inequality, the effect this has on politics, and what all this has to do with place. So I think it's really important to recognize that the 21st century has seen these widening regional disparities. So the US used to have this remarkable ability that the poorest counties in the country were the fastest growing. So between 1950 and 1980, that remained true, that you saw this convergence between the richest and poorest parts of the country. Since 1980, that relationship has reversed. And so what we've seen is that the poorest parts of the country have gotten poorer and the richest parts have gotten richer. And so this map shows you what's called the Vitality Index, which is an index of housing, unemployment, and a range of sort of quality of life factors. And you can see that there are these wide disparities across the country. And what's worse is those disparities are getting bigger. In particular, you see that it's these coastal sort of so-called superstar cities that have captured a lot of the gains. And this really comes down to the technological shifts towards digital technologies. And you see that the top 2% of metros have seen much faster wage growth and employment growth than the rest of the country. But it's not just regional inequalities that we have to worry about, whether it's race, and this chart is from the Federal Reserve that shows you widening gaps in racial wealth inequality. So the racial income gap in the post-civil rights era till the mid-1980s, it went from 8-to-1 to 5-to-1. In that time since the 80s, that has remained flat. We're still at 5-to-1 in that racial income gap. And so so it's not surprising that we see a certain degree of impatience. And the other key class divide that's really widened over the last few decades is by class. And by class, I mean education level. And so this chart shows you that particularly for high school dropouts and anyone below a full college degree, and particularly for men, they've seen declining wages or stagnating wages over that period of time. Whereas college workers and those with graduate degrees have seen really significant gains. And so these divisions are what really help explain our politics. And so here's a remarkable chart to me anyway. in that what we see here in this chart is the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of income inequality, and a polarization index, which shows you the ideological divide between Republicans and Democrats in Congress. And you can see that partisanship in the US has almost directly tracked inequality. And so these two things are inextricably linked. And when we think about the protests that have happened in the last 10 years or so, be it Black Lives Matter, Occupy Wall Street, Tea Party movement, and so on, they are all intimately tied to these problems of racial, place, and class-based inequality. So what has this got to do with climate change? Now, the key factor here is that for a long time we thought, okay, climate change, it's a global problem, we'll deal with it globally. We had the Montreal Protocol, that worked for HFCs, let's implement the Kyoto Protocol and our global government will fix it. Well, over the last 3 or 4 decades, what we've come to realize is that, as per this quote, climate policies create new economic winners and losers. This seems obvious to us today, but it means that climate policy is inherently tied to inequality, and that in order to address climate change, you need to address the local politics and the local inequities that sort of create that context and are ultimately impacted by the policies we choose. Now, this is really important because no matter what we do, no matter how many fossil fuel pipelines we protest or IPCC reports we put out, climate change remains near the bottom of the list of US voter priorities. And here you see, whether it's compared to the economy, healthcare, crime, in poll after poll after poll, no matter the political tactics, most voters just don't see it as a priority. And so something had to change. Now, the change, in my view, was highlighting these inequities in the context surrounding our climate policy and the impacts of the policies themselves. And so that means highlighting the place, race, and class-based dynamics in these industrial policies. And so here's a quote again from Biden's State of the Union, where he talks about, all across the country throughout, not just the coast, right? That's clearly a way of talking about place-based inequality. And when he says, and many jobs that do not require a college degree, he's talking about class-based inequality. So here you see an infographic just showing you some of the provisions within the Biden's Green Industrial Strategy targeting these 3 key dynamics of inequality. Whether it's place, you see eligibility for what are known as energy communities. There are some provisions that only rural counties are eligible for. There's the $8 billion towards hydrogen hubs, $3.5 billion for carbon capture hubs, $6 billion in the CHIPS Act for these regional innovation engines. When it comes to race, you also see the Justice 40 initiative, where 40% of the benefits of these provisions need to go to communities that fit that screening tool. There's also eligibility in many provisions for tribal nations. And then finally, in dealing with inequities of class, you see certain eligibility for low-income communities. There are Davis-Bacon prevailing wage requirements for many provisions. You have to have registered apprenticeships. There's also a series of provisions around community benefit and community workforce agreements, and of course around collective bargaining as well. So I want to speak very quickly to the importance of place-based economic policy, because this is something that has really shifted in the last 10 years or so. And it seems obvious to many of us now. And the point of this is that there are certain parts of the region that deserve and need sort of special attention when it comes to politics. And this matters for 3 reasons. First, you can address location-specific challenges. So the workforce development needs of North Carolina are going to differ significantly from the workforce development needs of Wyoming. So you need to account for that in the way you construct policy. It also encourages bottom-up problem solving. Exactly the sort of thing that we've experienced here in the last 2 days. Getting together and figuring out what works for us, how can we take advantage of the opportunities that are directed towards the region. And finally, place-based policies help develop productive industry clusters. And again, we're in the middle of the clean tech research triangle here. And so we know the benefits of clusters and the way they can create growth on growth. So just to speak very quickly to energy communities, which are a particular focus of the provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act. So you see a number of the provisions here targeting communities that either have higher than average fossil fuel employment, have seen retired coal mines or coal power plants, or some combination thereof. So there's a 10% adder on the clean electricity tax credits. There's $10 billion in the 48C manufacturing credits. And then, as I've mentioned, there's this $250 billion loan authority for the Loan Program Office. Here's a complicated slide that speaks a bit more to the Energy Infrastructure Reinvestment Program. But what the point of this is that a range of different projects are going to be eligible for what's going to be a really significant and important part of Biden's green industrial strategy, whether it's the power sector transition, whether you're trying to decarbonize an industrial process, whether it's community solar, clean manufacturing, a range of projects are going to be eligible so long as they meet these qualifying criteria. Now, to focus specifically on the Mid-Atlantic region, here's a map that combines the different definitions of energy communities for these 4 states, and that you can see that within the Mid-Atlantic region alone, there are over 2,000 brownfield sites, 500 counties with higher than average fossil fuel employment, 199 counties with a retired power plant, coal plant, and 118 counties with a retired coal mine. So these are the types of places that are going to be eligible for this funding. And I think that, that this could really power economic development in the region. So to finish up, I got to go back to my man, Hamilton. Now, I'm not going to make you read whole chunks of text from his report, though it does hold up remarkably well. But I think this is how he summarizes why we need industrial policy in this country. And I've sort of translated 18th century to 21st century for you. So why industrial policy? Well, it's a productivity boost. It boosts, it creates investment. It helps reduce inequality. You can burnish America's reputation. I think I'm an example of that. It's a big reason why I'm here. It helps reduce social and political divisions. It encourages entrepreneurship. And ultimately, it boosts economic growth. So thank you all for your time, and I appreciate it. Do we have time for questions? A couple?
Considering that you said America is having increased polarization between political parties, and the Biden administration has enacted most of these, do you think that the possibility that we could switch to a different political party in the next 4 years, do you think that is a risk for these policies, or how do you think we can deal with that going forward?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think there's a clear division in which party is more invested in the clean energy transition. But I think the Inflation Reduction Act was very smart in the way that it embedded a lot of these provisions into the system. So, for instance, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is $27 billion to create a series of green banks around the country. Now, you could have created a green bank within the government, and then a new administration could come along, gut the green bank, and cast it aside. But instead, this $27 billion is going to be distributed by the EPA to a range of nonprofits around the country, and those nonprofits then will be able to carry that mission forward in regionally or industry-specific ways. And I think that's true for a lot of policies, but they've also been smart in the type of provisions they chose. So clean electricity tax credits, for instance, have been a bipartisan solution for well over a decade in this space. And so I think provisions that are sort of hidden in the tax code tend to survive better politically.
First of all, I think I took screenshots of every single slide, and I was beginning to feel like maybe I should stop because it was a little stalkerish. But first, so it's a great presentation.
Thank you.
And my question is more literal. I help startups in climate basically get customers and capital. And I've been struggling to figure out how to help them figure out which of these could work for them. So there's so much money, it's almost an embarrassment of riches, but getting to which one is the right one would take me a lifetime. So is there like a shortcut for someone like me who's lazy?
No, it's a great question. It's something we're working on at RMI. So we have an initiative called America is All In, which has hundreds of partners around the country, from faith-based organizations to local governments to private entrepreneurs. And the America is All In website has a lot of resources available to help do exactly that. I think it's cleanenergy.gov is the White House's effort to do a sort of simplified version and prevent you having to endure what I endured of reading the damn thing. And then there are a number of other NGOs that are working on this. And I'd say that RMI is trying to be creative in how we reach communities. You know, we're growing fast, but we can't sort of speak to everybody. But if you have ideas of what would really help entrepreneurs, then we'd love to hear them. Great. Okay.
Hi. So during the presentation, you talked about, you were showing statistics about how we're trying to compete with China, and you mentioned the Credit Suisse report. What is China, how are they responding to all of this? Like, is that 50% cost reduction based on them? Is that based on where they are right now, or on estimates of how they intend to compete over the same time frame?
Yeah, so it's based on current trends. I mean, usually these modeling efforts don't assume further policy change, right? So China might decide to double down on their own subsidies. But I would say this is a good example where what we're seeing here isn't, you know, some sort of race to the bottom or zero-sum game as you see in a lot of the media. It's really a race to the top. So China is responding by investing faster than anybody else on the planet in renewable energy resources. And so if you look at China's growth curve on its renewable energy, it's exponential and it dwarfs anything that the US and Europe is doing. So, you know, we can play catch up, and it's still going to represent just a fraction of the type of deployment they're doing in a country of over 1 billion people with the type of energy intensive sectors they've got. So I think, you know, there's plenty of space in a rapidly growing pie for both countries to compete. And I think that's only going to help drive down costs further as companies come up with more innovative solutions. Ultimately, just having one supplier of all our solar, I think, has been damaging to the type of technological options we have available in the solar market. And so I expect this to really just ramp up production, but also continue to drive down that cost curve. I think that's the last one. So please, I'll be here if anyone wants to chat. Thank you very much.